Delighted to be with you. We'll have to figure out the right level of projection to make sure that it fits with the group in the room. As I said, delighted to be with you. I always bring along show and tell, and so what I did today was to bring two things that I just want to pass around the group. First of all, I brought the Hebrew scriptures in the original so that people can page through them and look at it. It also has the New Testament in Greek. It's a good, there are people who want to read the original text, so there it is. But the interesting thing is, of course, to begin looking at the Hebrew scriptures, you start from the front of the book here. That's the front of the book. And then if you want to read something in the New Testament, then you start in the back of the book. At least that's the way the Jewish people would understand it, in the back of the book, and look at it. Well, it's a good thing to hold it in your hand. The original text, both Hebrew First Testament and Greek New Testament, I'll put it right here, just pass it around up and down. I'll collect it at the end before I go home. This one I brought along because we've been experiencing in our country within the past year a growth in anti-Jewish reactions with some violence. Unfortunately, it's a tragic thing in the world in which we happen to live at this point. About 6 months ago, an individual who is a publisher, does a lot of writing, whose wife is a rabbi, so he's kind of involved in these issues quite a bit. We decided to publish a book, a little book, just came out 2 weeks ago, to deal with the current anti-Judaism that seems to be rising in our country. So I'm going to pass this around too, just for people to look at it and see the kinds of things that could be done in order to address the world in which we live. I am really delighted to be with you, but I have an outline. It changed about every 2 days. So the one that you have in your hand, I'm going to talk out of it, but I'm not going to follow exactly the same roadmap that I might have indicated when I put this together 5 days ago. I kept working at it and working at it and working at it and making what I hope will be a useful presentation. But the problem is, you bring your own questions, and I bring my own experience, and it's a challenge to try to figure out how to mesh what you're looking for when you come to this kind of a session this evening, or to mesh what I bring out of my experience. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, talk about my own experience in Christian Jewish dialogue is probably too formal for interaction. I want to talk about interaction and then talk about the scriptures, and I got a couple of passages which are basic to the whole Jewish experience. So let's see what happens, and I'm looking forward also to a period of questions. Come on in, folks. Come on in. The first Jewish person that I met, I was standing in St. Peter's Square in Rome, and it was in 1957. It was spring, and I was standing there waiting for the Holy Father's blessing, and there was a woman next to me, and I recognized that she was probably American, so I said, hello, and she said, hello, and she asked me where I was from. She heard my accent, asked me where I was from, and I said, well, I'm from the United States. Oh, she said, that's wonderful. Where in the United States? I thought, Wisconsin, I said. She said, where in Wisconsin? Well, I thought, I said Racine. She said, where in Racine? And it turned out that it was Gladys Gottlieb, the owner of the furniture store on 6th and was it Wisconsin? At any rate, Porter's. And so we became good friends, and I have to say that that would be the first Jewish person I ever met. What I want to do initially is to talk a little bit about my own experience in this area, because as the church has grown in appreciating Judaism, so also I've been part of that journey all the way along. And I thought it might be more personal, but also helpful if I kind of explored that a little bit. After 2 years in a parish, which I love very, very much, Archbishop Cousins called me in and said, I'd like you to send you away to school for Scripture. I thought, holy smokes, I'm not sure I like that idea. I said to the Archbishop, what do you need? He said, I really need somebody in Scripture. So I said, well, let's see what we can do. So, and he said, if you're not happy, let me know, because you're not going to do good work if you're not happy. I thought, that's a wonderful approach to the issue. So, all right, off I went. It was 1962. I walked over to St. Peter's Basilica. It was it was October 11th, the first day of the Second Vatican Council. I walked over to the piazza, and I thought to myself, this is really important. How can I get into St. Peter's for the opening day of the council? It was a bit devious. It wasn't dishonest, but it was a bit devious. So I found an older bishop with a great big suitcase of praying clothes, and I jumped over a fence in a way that I certainly couldn't do now. Jumped over a fence and went up to him, asked if I could help him. Oh, he said thank you. He was from Dominican, he was from the Caribbean, one of the islands in the Caribbean. He was a Dominican priest, bishop. So I became his secretary for the first opening day. Just for one day, I was his secretary. But what that did was to bring me into St. Peter's Basilica for the opening day of the Second Vatican Council, inside. And so therefore, and this is all part of the background, and also not just generic, remote background, it's right to the point. During the Mass, St. Pope John the 23rd explained why he wanted to have a council. He said there were three purposes in his mind. He said, first of all, renewal of the Catholic Church. We really do need to pull ourselves into a renewal mode that will make who we are and what we do more visible. Secondly, he said to the whole gathering, 2,000 bishops, Catholic bishops and observers from all over the world. Second thing, he said, I want reconciliation of Christian churches. That's what I'm hoping for, that somehow we can come together in a new way. And thirdly, he said, I hope that as a result of this council, that we can together address the modern world in a new way. So, there I heard him. I saw him for that opening Mass. And at the end of the Mass, here's my first point. At the end of the Mass, he asked us to take an oath that we would be obedient to the teachings of the council, whatever they would be. Whatever they would be, that we would be obedient to them, And, that's a serious thing, but it was the beginning of a remarkable experience for myself to then open to what the council came and underscored. So I started to study Scripture. I'm talking about my own journey here. Started to study Scripture at the Biblicum, Jesuit University in Rome. And after about 6 months, I found that, and I had decided I wanted to spend my energy in what we called, Old Testament, First Testament. I prefer the title First Testament. So I decided I would spend my time and energy in that field. Well, all I was doing was paging through dictionaries, and I thought, this is not the way to study this whole field. So I decided that I would broaden out my experience, and I went to Jerusalem, and I signed up for a school for immigrants to Israel. 2 months, I was in a class where only Hebrew was spoken, had a young Jewish, lo datit, she said. I'm not religious. She said, I'm not religious. She was our instructor. So for 5 hours a day, 6 days a week, we only heard and spoke Hebrew. And that was part of my, introduction to Old Testament studies, First Testament studies. Because I thought, this is a language. This is not just some kind of game, it's a language. And also in that context, I decided I really would like to go to the Orthodox section of the city of Jerusalem, the old Mea Shearim, 100 gates, go to that section and experience a Friday night introduction of the Sabbath prayer service. So I walked into this old section of the city and found a little synagogue, tiny little synagogue. There were 12 men there, just 12. So I listened and prayed with them. And at the end of the session, an old gentleman came over to me and he said, he said in Hebrew, he said, we Jewish people have an obligation to take in the stranger. And he said, you are obviously a stranger. And he said, would you like to come home to dinner? And in the course of my years, I've been ordained now 60 years, bishop 40 years. In the course of my life, I've been in all kinds of Catholic parishes. Never once has anybody offered that kind of invitation. But I remember that gentleman very clearly. And it was a wonderful experience and memorable. But all of that was part and parcel of this going to school with this group of people who were there because they wanted to become citizens of Israel, and they wanted to learn the language so they could get a job and settle into society. Well, then the First Testament, which I prefer to call it not Old Testament, but First Testament, became alive in a new and wonderful way for me. So that's part of my experience. Went back to Rome then, and of course all the debates were going on in the council. One series of debates was what to say about Judaism. Because on the one hand, more and more groups across the world, World Council of Churches, all kinds of groups around the world, were addressing the issue of Judaism. And were saying, we have discovered how much each of us, each group, made its own contribution to the anti-Judaic spirit in the world. And how do we rectify that? What do we do about it? So one of the issues for the Second Vatican Council was how to say, we're terribly sorry for what happened, because the whole Christian world somehow made a contribution to that over the centuries. And maybe we need to have a fresh start. So, out of the council, out of all the debates, came Nostra Aetate, in our age. And it was one of the council documents, which I recommend. It's not easy to read because it's got a certain flavor to it, rather formal style. But at any rate, they addressed the Islamic tradition, they addressed the Jewish tradition, and in the context said very clearly, you know what? The book I was going to read is on my chair at home. So, but they said very clearly that we abhor any expression of anti-Judaism that ever was existed, no matter who said it and where it was said. We reject all of that, and that was Nostra Aetate. Okay. In the meantime, we have learned that both Pius XII and also John the 23rd were trying very hard to deal with the Nazi reality during the Second World War, and then they worked very hard to save Jewish people in such a way that would be helpful and help change some of the terrible things that were going on in history. After I came home, 1965, because of that experience in Jerusalem, I found myself being invited to any number of Jewish groups nationally to be part of symposia, to give talks, whatever. And it became really a remarkable kind of experience to be part of the effort in this country, across the whole country, in order to start all over again. In a sense, we said we made some terrible mistakes over the 2,000 years. Maybe we could start all over again and do this better this time. So, part of that experience was to go on a pilgrimage with a group of rabbis and Catholic bishops to Auschwitz, to stand there and allow the echoes and the silence of the place to speak to us and to call us into a better world. At a certain point, I was elected chairman of the National Committee for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs. At a certain point in that, I was invited then, when Pope Benedict came to the United States in 2008, to introduce to him the leaders of the Jewish community, the Islamic community, the Jains community, the Hindu community in the United States. All of those were, I talk about that because all of that is part of the experience of trying to appreciate the reality of the first covenant and to make it our own in a new way. There's a text that comes in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapters 9 to 11. He deals with his relationship with the Jewish community. He himself, very Jewish, opening his life and the teachings of the covenant of the New Testament to Gentiles. He ends that section by saying, Romans 11:29, the gift and the grace of God is irrevocable. So that Paul in Romans and the Second Vatican Council acknowledged that Judaism continues to exist as a vital religion, and also that we as Christians have an obligation in a very real sense to keep it alive, to respect it and make it something that continues to be vital in our world. All of that is, as I say, part of the background that we bring to this question. In 1947, a shepherd, and here I'm beginning to talk about rediscovering the Jewish Jesus. In 1947, a shepherd down near the Dead Sea was looking for a lost sheep, a goat I think it was, as a matter of fact, that ran into one of the caves. And he threw some stones into the cave to try to get the goat to come out so that he could take it back where it should be. And he heard it hit something, like a clay vessel. And that was the beginning of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were in this cave for 2,000 years. And so in 1947, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of a sudden the Jewish world of the first century came alive in a way that it had not been before. So, the oldest text of what we call the First Covenant was from the 9th century that we had before that. All of a sudden, we had copies of the original Old Testament, First Testament, 1,000 years older than the ones that had existed before, 1,000 years older. And in order then to take a closer look and to realize that it had been preserved almost word for word for another 1,000 years, so that, come to appreciate. Well, In the first century, Judaism was very vibrant with all kinds of different groups of people that were all Jewish and had different approaches to the scriptures, to life, to the world in which they lived. We don't think about the diversity in our own Christian traditions. I mean, having had that ecumenical responsibility nationally, I'm very conscious of the difference between the Lutherans and the Baptists and the Anglicans and the Methodists. I'm very conscious of all of that. But most people outside of it, it's just, you're all Christian, just as we think they're all Jewish. We don't understand the diversity that existed. First century, there was an enormous Jewish diversity. So that you had, for example, you had the Sadducees, who were the priestly group. They were very traditional. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, and if it wasn't in there, it didn't matter. Then we had the Pharisees, who were remarkable people in terms of their religious convictions, the Pharisees, great good people who felt that religion was exercised not only in the temple, but also in the home, and that all the holiness that would be associated with the temple was also associated with the kitchen table. So that this sacrifice in the temple, that was one thing, but the conversations and the discussions that occurred in the home were as holy as the discussions that went on in the temple. And Jesus was a Pharisee. I mean, he was very much part of that tradition, which is why the Gospels keep talking about him as going to dinner with people, having conversations with people. Judaism was remarkably diverse in the first century, with the Pharisaic tradition, with that group of people on the Dead Seas who said the whole temple is defiled, and we're going to sit down, we're going to move to the Dead Sea area, live down there, and wait for the Messiah to come. Another different group of people. The Zealots. We have one of the apostles of our own Christian tradition who was a zealot. They believed that the only way to renew Judaism and to be part of the kingdom of God was revolution. And so they were pushing for some kind of revolution against the Roman authorities in the first century that would give the Jewish tradition the kind of freedom and opportunities that existed. So, what I want to point out is that the first century in which Jesus existed and taught and lived, died and rose again, was a very fertile and vital with all kinds of different Jewish groups that existed at that point. And the Pharisees were really wonderful folks. One of the problems that we have is that in the first century, Christians, people who believed in the resurrection, the teaching and resurrection of Jesus, were just one. They were all Jewish. It was one group of Jewish people all together. Gradually in the first century, the Jewish folks began to be suspicious of the Christians who started to talk about a trinity, because the Jewish tradition would say there's only one God. And the Christians were talking about 3 persons in one God. So they began to divide and go in separate ways. Then even more than that, as the Jewish leaders moved toward some kind of rebellion against Rome, the Jewish folks, non-Christian Jewish folks said, we're not like those Christian Jews over there. We're not like them. And the Christians would say, we're not like them because we're just different and we don't want to get involved with the Roman authorities. So you have a growing division between Jewish Christians and Jewish non-Christians. Then the Gospels were written in such a way that it already reflects the arguments that they had with each other. And as a result of that, our Gospels will often present the Pharisees as opposed to Jesus and as fighting, even though they were arguing, but it was all within the family. Family arguments. It's within the same family. We understand and we argue, but we're within the same family. We forget that and don't always understand it and appreciate it. Yes?
Isn't arguing among the people a big part of what Jewish tradition is?
Oh, it always is. There are, but that's probably true of Italians too, and who knows other groups. But yes. So they playfully say, my Jewish friends playfully say, 2 Jews, three opinions. Okay. Now what I want to do is help understand that Judaism went through its own development, and I have this handout here, first of all, the earliest covenant that we have is on this handout. It's chapter 24 of the book of Exodus, and it is written as if they had just come out of Egypt, and they had this experience at the base of the mountain where the 10 Commandments came from. But the way they describe it is that it's a family treaty. So let me talk about that just for a moment. Chapter 24, middle of the page. They were at the bottom of the mountain. They were having a sacrifice. And you see there were some young fellows that were asked to sacrifice animals as a communion offering. Communion offering meant for the Jewish people that it was a sacrifice in which everybody participated afterwards. You had a meal. The meal was part of taking the sacrifice and sharing it and then being part of a single family. But look at the ritual. Moses took half of the blood, put it in bowls. The other half splashed it on the altar. Then, taking the book of the covenant, that summary of their covenantal relationship, he read it aloud to the people, who answered, "Everything that the Lord has said, we will hear and we will do." Then Moses took the blood of the sacrifice and then splashed it on the people. Now, I linger over that for a moment, because at the heart of the Jewish experience is this sacrifice, but this sacrifice which means that they are adopted into God's family. I mean, that's how they understood that sacrifice, because life is in the blood. They didn't have the same kind of knowledge of the human body as we would, but if someone was injured and hurt and fell on the ground and the blood went out, they died. So the conviction was that the life was in the blood, and in this sacrifice, if the blood was sprinkled both on the people and on the altar, then they understood that they were members of one family. That's the oldest experience in Judaism, that they were members of God's family, that He had adopted them into the same family. And out of that basic family ritual, 3 things always occurred, and I listed them there just above chapter 24. That the 3 things that occurred that were part of any family, and that were certainly part of the family by which the Jewish people became members of God's family, 3 consequences. One was what they call hesed, and it means mercy. but not just any kind of mercy. And in fact, the mercy that is behind Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy in our ritual, the background to that in Hebrew is hesed. And it means that we belong to the same family and we promise to take care of each other. So when we say in the Eucharist, Lord have mercy, we're not saying we're poor, miserable people, please take care of us. We're saying to God, we belong to the same family. You have an obligation to take care of us. It's kind of a bit of an arrogant sort of approach. But the consequence of being a member of the same family, as we all know from members of our own family, you have to take care of each other. And it's an understanding that it's an obligation. So a consequence of being adopted in the covenant into members of the same family, the Jewish people understood immediately that therefore God has to somehow take care of them. And they have to take care of each other in a way. And we've inherited that and incorporated it into our Eucharist immediately. The second consequence of being members of the one family that Judaism assumes and rejoices in is shalom. Now, shalom means peace. Yes, but it's a certain kind of peace. And it's certainly not the kind of peace that happens when the kids are finally in bed and it's quiet at night. And you can turn on the television if you want or turn it off. It's not that kind of peace quiet. It's always the reconciliation of the parts back into one again. That shalom means putting the parts back together again. So one of the consequences of the covenant, the Jewish covenant, is that they feel very strongly that we're back into union again with each other. And in fact, in Hebrew today, if I borrow money from someone and finally I give it back, the word for restoring the money that I borrowed from someone to the right owner is eshalem. I eshalem it back to its proper owner. I restore it to unity in their pocket where it's supposed to be. But the covenant assumes that another consequence of the covenant is shalom, is peace. And then the third consequence is justice. But justice in the covenantal sense. In other words, if I pay my debts, in one sense, that's a kind of justice. I pay what I owed, and that's justice. But that's not what the covenant talks about. Tzedakah is, for the Jewish people, it's the kind of justice that results when everything is in right relationship with everything else. So it's a kind of universal justice. It's a kind of everything is back in its right place and related to everything else. Those are the consequences of the covenant on Sinai and of any covenant that exists. Covenant brings people back together and has those consequences. Well, the history of Israel is just very, very fascinating because you have, David wanting to build a temple, being told by God, no, you're not the one to do it. Your son Solomon will build the temple. Then in 612, King Josiah decides he's going to fix up, restore. It's kind of like the television program where you get an old house and put it back together again. I watched that many nights. So the king decided that he would restore the temple, and they found then this old piece of scrap buried, and they didn't know what it was. They took it to the temple. They asked a prophetess, Huldah was her name, And they said, we found this underneath the temple. We're not sure what it's all about. Take a look at it. Tell us what you think it is. And she said, this is Huldah, 612 BC. She said, this is the covenant. You are obliged. And so you need to take this seriously. And at that point, the people of Israel stopped being the people of the covenant and became the people of the book, so that the reference was to something written, not just to the relationships of people. It was to something written. And that was the beginning then of the way in which the Jewish community became attached and concerned about what was written down, to which they returned again and again and again. Temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586, 587 BC. And groups of people from Jerusalem, Jewish people, leadership, went into exile in Babylon. And in Babylon, they had no temple. They could not offer sacrifice. So the Jewish religion changed, developed, I probably should say. Without a place to offer sacrifice, then what was important? Well, the diet, kosher diet, would be very important. The Torah, having a copy of the scroll of God's Word, became very important. Circumcision became very important for them as they were in exile. And so that was a development that, from the 6th century before Christ, grew in its own way to identify the Jewish tradition and the Jewish folks and the way in which they maintained fidelity to God. And then they came back about 536, 37 BC, about 60 years later, rebuilt the temple. Everybody said it was never the same. But they had been prepared by God's providence for an existence without the temple. They developed their own life. They moved to see that what had been a covenant, that was a family development with God adopting a whole people as members of his own family, maybe needed some updating. And they looked around, the Jewish people looked around and said, there are many covenants that are international agreements. And so maybe the family covenant isn't the only thing that we could use to explain how we are related to God. Maybe we can talk about God not as the head of the family, but as a great king. And so they adopted, the Jewish folks adopted the form of the covenant, moving from family agreement to a document in which they had someone identifying himself, the king, the great king, this is my name, this is what I've done for you, these are my expectations, and if you obey, you will be blessed. If you don't obey, you will be cursed. And let's have a sacrifice that celebrates your acceptance of God's, Jewish acceptance of God as the great king. So the covenant developed, and Jewish people developed with it. I have from Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments. They really, it's an interesting development, because there you have the introduction, I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and then a series of commandments. But the commandments are intended not to be things that you exactly obey, but they are things that you need to talk about. In other words, to discuss what they mean and what they demand and what they request. So Exodus 20 is patterned after that Assyrian international treaty that identifies who the king is, what the king has done for you, calling God the king, what God has done for his people, and what the expectations are. In every case, number one, the 10 Commandments, they should begin with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And then the commandment would come. And then each one, I am the Lord your God who brought you out. This is what I did for you. This is what I expect back. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. But, they are intended really to be areas of discussion. In the Jewish tradition, if I suddenly say in my tradition, the Jewish tradition, they are intended to be things that we talk about. There are other kinds of law in the Hebrew Scriptures. We call it case law. Exodus 31. There's another. If a man has an ox, and the ox is accustomed to gore people, and he doesn't keep it, tethered, and it gets out, and it gores somebody, all the circumstances that are there, and then there's a penalty for not doing what one should do. That's a whole different kind of law. That's case law. It's the kind of law that goes, that is parsed in courts and in legal documents. The 10 Commandments are not that kind of law. They are the kind of, the kind of law that isn't really a law, it's a principle that invites people to talk about what it means at this point in history, what it means in this culture, what it means for these people. The movement to put the 10 Commandments into the courtroom is completely wrong. It doesn't understand that the 10 words, Devarim, the 10 words are really things that we need to talk about as to what they mean. They don't resolve disputes, they open up disputes. And therefore they say this is an area that's holy. Our relationship to our parents, our relationship to family members, our relationship over what we think we own. All the 10 Commandments are areas that are intended not to resolve questions, not to resolve arguments, but to open up discussion so that people have a good sense of what they demand today here in this place. So they should be in universities. They shouldn't be in courtrooms. The 10 Commandments, they're not to resolve disputes. That's a different kind of law. They're to open up discussion. So, here we are with a sense of the way in which Judaism has evolved. The Judaism of the first covenant stopped with the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in the year 69. And Christians and Jews, we are really cousins because each of us started in that first century in such a way that we need to look to see how we can be mutually supportive at this point. So I thought that it might be helpful to take a look at these two different covenants and to realize that as a result of these covenants, the Jewish community continues to exist in our midst. They are held by God, and the grace and gift of God is irrevocable. They are not superseded by Christianity. They continue to exist as a viable form of God's people, and we have an obligation to take care of each other in tradition. There's a strong sense that we're not looking for conversion of Jewish people. We are recognizing that they need to be respected, and that in God's plan, God will bring us together in a way that we hadn't anticipated. There are just so many things that could and maybe should be said, but at least this is a basic introduction on my part to the tradition which Jesus, as a good Jewish person, with all the colleagues of his time, received, lived, practiced, and then, and retained and allowed it to develop in its own way. I come to talk about the title that I proposed is Meeting the Rest of the Family, an Introduction to Judaism. And Judaism continues to be in our midst as a way of talking about the family of Jesus. The whole first century was a time when everyone was Jewish and in Israel and in the church, and only through the work of St. Paul did he move out to include non-Jewish people as part of the family. I hope that makes some kind of sense. And I hope that it's an introduction to where we are at this point in history. Some observations or some questions? Yes, please. If Francis goes to the Amazon,
or at least to those bishops there that are kind of separated from including, the lack of any kind of a lot of traditional stuff we associate with Christianity, priestly, clergy, all that kind of stuff. He goes to the Amazon and he finds need to rethink how they bring sacraments and the Word of God to people by recognizing the gifts in the community. Is he not really just being a good Jew? I mean, the idea.
I haven't a clue where this is coming from.
I'm thinking, like you said, when the Jews went into exile and they learned from the Assyrians the idea of kings and stuff and kind of reshaped their image of a people who became different as they learned in their experiences. Wouldn't what's going on in the Amazon be a kind of a small version of relearning how to be current?
Well, I think that's part of going through the whole world, because we're learning the blessing of Orthodox Christianity, in which Orthodox Christianity, the Eastern Church, every nation has the authority to be rooted in the New Testament, but then make the New Testament come alive in its own way, in their culture, their language, and Francis is encouraging that. But so would Pius XII have encouraged that in his own way. I mean, each nation needs to find a way to be Catholic Christian. And that's only one example. But it's a moment where I think, what does that mean? Nothing. But we can learn from Eastern Orthodoxy that Romanian Christianity and Greek Christianity and Russian Christianity has similarities rooted in the New Testament, rooted in the experience of the church, but they each have their own way of being Christian and being Catholic Christian or Orthodox. It's just one example of something that needs to go on throughout the whole world. That's how I would respond. But back to the issue of Judaism, and Judaism in our time and age, here's one.
When you use that terminology for Catholic Christian or Christian Catholic, I remember that we also had the terminology of Judeo-Christian.
Yes.
And so... It doesn't. Now it does.
No, it's a miracle.
It is a miracle. So we have a Judeo-Christian that I recall that we would refer to ourselves. Then it became Catholic Christian. Then it became Christian Catholics.
Yeah.
So, what should we begin to bring about this, consistency?
Okay. Number one, it seems to me that at this point in history, we have a serious obligation to reclaim our Jewish roots. And you know, Germany, the horrors of Germany in killing off so many million Jewish people because that was somehow less human. We all, our own traditions contributed to that in some way over the centuries. And we have to figure out a way to make sure that that never comes back again. And to do our own sort of reparation. And so to claim ourselves as, in some way, even though most of us are Gentiles, not Jewish by background, that we have inherited a Jewish religious experience from the first century Christian communities, all of whom were Jewish, until Paul got to work and invited other folks in and tried to figure out how to blend these two together. They were all Jewish at the beginning. Jesus, Mary, everybody was Jewish. All the apostles, they were all Jewish. We have to come to a point of reclaiming that Judea heritage and understanding that that's part of the gift of God that isn't just something in history, but it continues to be a community which God loves dearly and has chosen to be a light to the world in which we live. I mean, we have to reclaim that in a way that will allow their witness to the one God and to the choice of God to shine forth from everything we are and do. Okay, does that make? So we're reclaiming it in a sense, but there's so many different names for the reality, and each one has its own truth, because each of the titles has something that's correct in it. But every title is just a title. It's not the whole reality. Okay, thank you. There was a hand back there, please.
In your 58-year journey since 1962, what are some of the high points in your life where you feel that you have started to reclaim your Jewish roots, you as a person?
Oh.
Can you identify certain, you already identified events in your life, but can you identify other things that you're asking us to do? Do you have any suggestions to us in terms of how we might do that?
I always need to,
coming to this talk was a good thing to do, no?
I always need to go home and think about, a question and then come up with an answer. I'm not the kind of person that has a quick response. But it seems to me that recognizing the Jewish background that we have all received is a first step. And St. Augustine has a phrase. Augustine says, this is in his Confessions, nihil nisi per amicitiam. And he's talking about conversion. And his comment is, we don't change our minds except through friendship. So my response is that any time I have entered into a good friendship with someone who is the other and come to respect that person, and in case of your comment, someone who is a good, practicing, loyal Jewish person, that's a moment of growth for everybody, and everybody changes. My teacher in Jerusalem, Leah Rotham, wonderful woman. She was frightened of me, as I suggested when I showed up in her class, because she admitted later on in our own kind of friendship with her and her husband Leo, that when she had seen a priest coming, because we all wore cassocks at that point, if she saw a priest coming on the street, she'd go to the other side of the street because she was so frightened of priests. And here I am in her class, number one, and then we become good friends, number two, and then as I was leaving, she invited me to her house, and I gave her her first mezuzah, that scroll that gets put on the doorpost in a Jewish home. I gave her her first one. She never had one before. Now that so, it's friendship that leads into mutual respect. That is whenever that happens, it's just a moment of grace and change. Now, that night, that very same night, was my last night in Jerusalem, I gave them their mezuzah. We had a wonderful conversation. Her husband, Leo, decided he was going to put it up that night in my presence. So it's in an apartment house, and he gets out his nail and his hammer, and he starts pounding it into the doorpost. 10 o'clock at night. So we said, Leo, b'sheket, to be quiet, because it's 10 o'clock at night, He says, never mind. He goes to the window into the courtyard of this apartment house, opens the window, and he says, for heaven's sakes, he said, this is Leo Rotham. Whoever is making all that noise, it's 10 o'clock at night. And he slams the thing shut. And then he said to me, they'll never guess it was me. So my in answer to the question, it's through friendship. St. Augustine said it, and it continues to be true. When you get to know someone well, to know and respect, we change, and that's a step forward.
Isn't that an antidote to our polarization?
Yes, by all means. And that's a terrible reality we live in that needs to be broken down in some way. Please.
So, I don't know a Jewish person that I know of. And the question is, are they that rare around here? Are they segregated? Are they just in different places?
Well, that's a good question, but it depends on what kind of Jewish person we're talking about. Because there is a group, the Mea Shearim folks, the fellow who invited me home to dinner in Jerusalem, that live in their own enclave and follow the rules of diet and everything very carefully. So they live separated, but the other kinds of Reform Judaism, they're I want to say everywhere, but it's a reality that's interspersed in our society. I had one of the talks that I was privileged to give out at Boston College. Is this a golden moment in Christian-Jewish relations? And I was asked to respond to that. And part of my response was, I think it's a new moment, but I can't say that the Jewish folks would agree that this is a new moment for them, because they've had these new moments before. And in fact, in 18th century Germany, it was a remarkable freedom, and then all of a sudden the Hitler reality came into being, and they were put to death. Now I had two relatives in Czechoslovakia that were killed by the Nazis as well. Two young women, beautiful young women. So it wasn't only Jewish people that were killed, but was all kinds of folks. And that needs to be healed. And so reaching out to Judaism and to Jewish people, I don't like to say Jews. There's somehow that has a flavor about it. Jewish people. Reaching out to them, and just in normal conversation, friendship is a wonderful thing. But you can't buy it. You can't. It just happens if we're open to it. And I recommend that we take care of each other in that sense as well. Oh, we're past 7. I think one more.
One more question.
Am I here? In the radio show, Two Guys in a Gospel, Father Ricardo often mentions that the Gospels written by Matthew are the most Jewish of Gospels. Why would he say that, or why does he say that? I know he's right.
Because the Jewish community, the Matthean community, was made up of both Jews and Gentiles. But the Jewish, Matthew's Gospel talks about Jesus as the Messiah, the kingly figure. The whole gospel continues to lift him up as that. Luke would talk about Jesus as a prophet, as a great prophet. Someone else, the different Gospels each have their own theology. But Matthew's talks about the Davidic tradition, and and so tries to develop that in its own way.
Thank you. And thank
Okay.
you for this wonderful evening. This is really important and
Okay.
special.
Thank you.